All right, everyone. Ready for a deep dive into a pop culture phenomena? We're talking American Pie, the whole franchise. From the first film that had everyone talking to those sequels and spin-offs, some maybe more memorable than others.
And we're going beyond just reminiscing about those awkward teenage moments. We're breaking down what made this franchise explode and which films, according to our source, have really stood the test of time.
Okay, so you handed me this detailed analysis, and it's ranking every single American Pie movie. It feels like I'm holding, like, the sacred recipe book. Instead of pie crusts, we're dealing with comedic insights here.
Precisely. Think of it as our guide to understanding why some of these films reached comedic perfection, while others, well, maybe left a bad taste in our mouths. And we're starting with a few that, shall we say, landed at the bottom of the pie plate.
The ones that maybe should have stayed in the oven a little longer.
Perhaps. Let's consider American Pie Presents Bandcamp. Our source suggests that trying to recapture that Stifler magic with a new generation, well, it fell a little flat. Seems like relying too heavily on a familiar formula, even with a beloved character, doesn't guarantee comedic success.
So it's like trying to recreate a classic recipe, but with generic ingredients, right? You might recognize the flavors, but it just doesn't have that same oomph. What about The Book of Love? Did that spin-off manage to escape the bottom of the ranking?
Not quite. This film apparently leaned a little too hard on that whole sex Bible gimmick, almost like they forgot about the essential ingredients of a compelling story, engaging characters, strong narrative, that kind of thing. A good prop doesn't necessarily make a good movie.
It's like they put all their effort into decorating the pie crust and forgot to actually bake the filling.
Very astute observation. And then we have The Naked Mile. Now, this one's fascinating because, well, it actually receives a split decision in our source material.
Intriguing. Tell me more about this divided opinion.
So, in the grand ranking of all the films, it sits closer to the bottom. The source acknowledges its dedication to that classic American Pie humor, outrageous situations, awkward encounters, the works, but it lacks a strong narrative structure. Those hilarious moments, while entertaining, they just aren't held together by a cohesive plot.
So it's like a pie with a fantastic filling, but absolutely no crust to contain the delicious chaos.
Exactly. However, and this is where it gets interesting, when ranked solely among the spin-offs, The Naked Mile emerges as a bit of a fan favorite.
So which is it? Is it a cinematic masterpiece, or is it a comedic misfire?
Well, it highlights the different criteria we use when we judge sequels and spin-offs versus those original films. Sometimes audiences crave that familiar, over-the-top humor without needing a deep, complex storyline. The Naked Mile, it seems, scratches that particular itch.
Like a warm slice of pie on a cold day, sometimes you just want that comforting, familiar flavor.
Precisely. And speaking of comfort food versus, let's say, gourmet dining, the American Pie franchise certainly offers a diverse menu of comedic experiences.
Which brings us to the middle of the ranking, where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah, it's like this franchise is trying to find the balance, between outrageous humor and actual character development. It's in these middle films where the American Pie recipe tries some new things. Sometimes it works, sometimes not so much.
Okay, so which films landed in this comedic gray area?
American Reunion, for starters. The big one. Right. Trying to get that original cast back together as adults. Our source says it had its moments, but the humor felt forced, like it was desperately trying to recapture that old magic.
I remember watching American Reunion, and it felt like the characters were stuck between those teenage selves and their adult lives. Like they were trying to fit into something that didn't quite suit them anymore.
Right. And the analysis gets really interesting here. It argues American Reunion shows just how tough it is to revisit characters years later. The things that made them hilarious as teenagers, that immaturity, that recklessness, it feels out of place when you're an adult.
It's tough, right? How do you stay true to who a character is while showing that people, hopefully grow up a bit? And speaking of, what's the deal with The Naked Mile being ranked twice in our source?
Oh, yeah. Remember how we were talking about different standards for sequels and spin-offs? Seems like for diehard American Pie fans, The Naked Mile, flaws and all, it still captures a feeling of the originals that American Reunion, with its big cast and attempts at growth, kind of missed.
It's like The Naked Mile is that comfort food of the franchise. You come back to it for pure nostalgia. And American Reunion is like that more ambitious, but maybe not as satisfying attempt at something fancier.
Perfect analogy. Sometimes sticking to the formula just works. Maybe even better than reinventing the wheel.
Which brings us to the top tier. Those films that, according to what we got here, represent the very best of American Pie in terms of humor and, well, Heart.
And this is where it's so interesting. The source really digs into what makes an American Pie film truly great. Is it just the crazy stuff, the lines everyone quotes? Or is it about friendship and love, figuring out that awkward transition into adulthood?
Pretty important ingredients for any good comedy.
Exactly. And the film that, according to the source, nails all of that is American Wedding.
American Wedding. Wow, that's a surprise. It's definitely one of the more, let's say, mature films in the whole franchise.
Yeah.
Why the top spot, though?
It says that American Wedding gets the balance right. It's got that raunchy humor, but also real emotional depth. The characters grow, they change, but they're still all about that friendship and love that makes the franchise work.
I remember American Wedding felt like a natural next step for those characters. Still figuring things out, still messing up,
Yeah.
but there's this sense of maturity, of knowing that actions have consequences. That wasn't really there as much in the earlier films.
Right. And audiences connected with that. It was like the franchise was maturing along with them. Growing up doesn't mean you can't still laugh, you know?
Speaking of growing up, where does the original American Pie land in all of this?
You might be surprised the one that started it all, launched 1,000 quotes and awkward memories. It's at a very respectable second place.
Second, so it's not just nostalgia. We're saying this source thinks it's genuinely one of the best.
Absolutely. Our source praises the original for its impact, for how it captured what it felt like to be a teenager on the edge of adulthood. It says, sure, some of the humor hasn't aged perfectly, but the heart of the film, that message of friendship and finding yourself that still resonates today.
American Pie somehow manages to be both a product of its time and a timeless coming-of-age story, then, which leaves one last slice of this puzzle, American Pie 2.
And here's the real shocker. The film that, according to this analysis, takes the top spot, the very best of the entire American Pie franchise, is the sequel, American Pie 2.
American Pie 2.
Really?
The sequel usually gets overshadowed. What makes it stand out?
The source raves about American Pie 2. It takes everything that worked in the first one and turns it up. The characters, while still up to their crazy antics, they've grown. They're more aware of themselves, their desires, their insecurities, which makes their whole comedic journey even more engaging.
It's funny you say that because when I watched American Pie 2, the humor felt sharper, more confident, but it still had that heart, that camaraderie that made the first film work so well.
Exactly. And this brings up a really important question our source asks. What makes a sequel better than the original?
That's the question that haunts so many franchises. Is it just about giving people more of the same, or is there some secret ingredient that takes a sequel from good to incredible? So American Pie 2, the sequel, reigning supreme. It really makes you think about what goes into a great sequel. Is it just cranking things up to 11, or is there something more?
It's a really interesting question, right? Our source suggests American Pie 2 nails that feeling of being caught between adolescence and adulthood. Like those characters and maybe even the audience are in this weird spot where the future's exciting, but also kind of scary.
That time when you're holding on to those carefree days, but also trying to figure out who you are, what you want out of life.
Exactly. I think that's why for a lot of people, American Pie 2 feels really relatable. It takes you back to when friendships felt unbreakable, anything felt possible, and the biggest worry was which party to hit up.
A big dose of nostalgia, but also makes you think back on those times, maybe with a little bit of what were we thinking?
Totally. And it circles back to that question our source asks. Do good comedies, especially franchises, need to change to stay relevant?
It's a balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have American Wedding trying to grow up with the audience, talking about commitment, responsibility, and how even though growing up's a drag, you don't have to lose your sense of humor.
And then American Pie 2 goes another way, capturing a feeling and experience that connects with people no matter their age.
So is there a right way to evolve a comedy franchise?
That's what's so great about art, right? There's no one formula. American Pie, with all its ups and downs, its experiments, and its sticking to what works, it shows how tricky and interesting it can be to make comedy last.
It reminds us that humor is subjective, just like a good pie. What one person loves, another might not.
Exactly. As we wrap up our deep dive into American Pie, I think the big takeaway is that no matter where you rank each film, it's sparked conversations, brought back memories, and reminded us that laughter, even when it's messy and unpredictable, is a pretty important part of life.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think we've earned a slice of pie after all that.
I'd say so. And to everyone listening, what does American Pie mean to you? Which film really stuck with you, and why?
Until next time, happy watching, and may your pies always be full of laughter and good company.